Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
He said it loud enough for the people at the cake table and the cousin with a phone in his hand, and even my ex's new wife to hear, and he said it with that lazy little smirk he learned from his father. "You were never there for me. You do not belong here." And I swear to you, I felt something inside me go very still, not broken or shattered or dramatic, just still, like when a doctor stops asking questions because she already knows the diagnosis and the only thing left is to decide what to do about it. I clapped, because the principal had finished talking and because there was nothing to gain from matching a boy's sting with my own, and I kept clapping while the little circle around him pretended not to notice me. And I watched him hold court like he always does when there is free food and an audience and a story where he gets to be the kid who raised himself, which is convenient, considering who paid the bills that made his self-reliance so comfortable. I stood there and thought about the mornings when I left before sunrise with coffee in a travel mug because a promotion does not wait for daycare hours. And I thought about the nights when I fixed typos on his essays while he was asleep because feedback is easier to accept from a teacher who writes nice comments in the margins. And I thought about the way his father learned to weaponize charm, pretending to be the fun parent while I was the invoice parent, the deadline parent, the tuition parent, the boring one, the reliable one, the one who gets called cold because she says no to a gaming chair while she says yes to another semester. He caught my eye once and rolled his, and it hit me that he expected me to flinch, to leave, to create a scene that would confirm the story he has been rehearsing for years, the one where I am the villain who made his life hard while other people smoothed the path for him. And I surprised myself by feeling only relief, because finally he had said the quiet part out loud, and once a thing is spoken it can be answered, not with a counterspeech or a tearful confrontation, but with the kind of answer that lives in the grown-up world where contracts sit in drawers and signatures are not applause. I chose a paper plate, put a slice of cake on it, and walked it to one of his classmates who always thanked me when I drove them to practice, and I said congratulations, and I stayed exactly as long as a polite guest should. Because courtesy is not weakness, and leaving on my terms mattered more to me than any performance of hurt he hoped I would give him. On the drive home, I did not blast music or cry into a steering wheel. I did what I always do when something hurts. I inventory facts. I lay them out. I check the documents. I ask myself what is fair and what is useful and what will actually teach rather than simply punish, because I do not want a son who fears me. I want a man who can stand without me, and the difference between those two outcomes is a choice. So I went to my desk and unlocked the drawer that holds the papers everyone jokes about until they need them, and I read the trust language again, every line I fought for when I signed the divorce, the clause about educational support, the clause about discretion, the clause about my sole authority to pause distributions when certain conditions are met, the clause he has never bothered to read because reading is not as fun as telling people you have a fund. I opened my laptop, logged into the custodian portal, and sat with my fingers on the keys for a full minute, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to remember the exact feeling of this decision. The mixture of calm and sadness and a tiny pulse of anger that kept rhythm while I weighed mercy against consequences, and then I moved the cursor and I started the transfer, not to a shopping spree, not to a revenge vacation, but away from his automatic pipeline, away from the monthly cushion that allows him to treat me like a doormat while standing on a floor I built. The system asked me to confirm, and I did, and then it asked whether I wanted to suspend the card tied to the account, and I did that too, and then it asked whether I wanted to notify the beneficiary, and I clicked no. Because I did not owe him another speech. Instead, I took out a plain white no card, wrote 2 words in the middle, figure it out, and slid it into an envelope with his name in the corner. And I placed it on the entry table where he tosses his keys when he comes by to raid my fridge and pretend we are fine. I sat there a while longer and looked at the calendar and thought about milestones and what they cost and who pays and who claps, and I sent one text to his father that said, "I will not be attending any after parties," and another to my sister that said, "Please do not come over tonight." And then I turned off the lamp, because nothing else needed to be said. The decision was made, and the part everyone likes to perform, the part with the speeches and the smirks and the crowd, that part was over. By morning he would discover that applause is cheap and signatures are not, and by evening my phone would light up like a slot machine, but that was tomorrow's noise. Tonight was the quiet where a mother stops waiting for respect and starts building the lesson that makes it possible. People love to say I was not there, and they say it with the confidence of guests who never looked at a bill, which is why I learned a long time ago to keep a quiet ledger of what was real, because when stories get loud the only thing that cuts through is proof. And I am a boring woman who keeps proof, not because I enjoy being the hall monitor of my own life, but because someone in this family had to remember what things cost and who kept paying when everyone else grew tired or distracted or busy being charming. I worked through the years when he still needed rides to practice and rides to tutoring and rides to a pharmacy at midnight because a project was due and the printer had died. And I worked through the years when he decided rules were beneath him because his father liked to toss out phrases like free spirit and misunderstood genius. And I worked through the years when he said he would never be corporate like me because he would create. And I never told him that creating is not a personality, it is a schedule and a budget and a habit you keep when no one claps, because teenagers do not hear that sentence until life says it with consequences, and life had been postponed for him by my deposits. The trust was part of a divorce that felt like splitting a house with a man who always took the sunny room, and when we negotiated the documents I fought for discretionary control, not to micromanage his adulthood, but to make sure the money did not become a leash tied to his father's ego or a faucet left open for every bad idea, and the lawyer wrote the language cleanly. Discretionary distributions for education and living needs as determined by the custodial parent, with the power to pause or redirect if the beneficiary demonstrates irresponsibility or hostility that endangers his own welfare, and at the time I thought that phrase sounded dramatic, but I kept it. Because I have met teenage arrogance and I have met adult entitlement, and I know how quickly they shake hands. There were years when I almost used that clause and chose not to, like the summer he blew through a semester's allowance on equipment he swore would turn him into a producer, which lasted exactly 4 weeks. After which the equipment gathered dust while I covered the landlord's late fee and reminded him that leases are not flexible just because your dream is. And there was the spring his car ended up with 3 unpaid tickets, because the meter was an insult to his genius. Tickets I paid because the car was in my name and I could not afford a boot, and there were the polite dinners where his father joked that I would make a great bank teller, and I nodded because sometimes silence keeps the peace long enough to finish the salad. When he said I did not belong at his celebration, I felt every one of those receipts crinkle in my chest, not because I wanted to shove them in his face. I do not collect receipts to win arguments. I collect them so I can look at myself and know I was not crazy, and the ledger told a story I recognized. A mother who funded stability, and a father who performed love, and a son who learned to perform with him. And once I named it that clearly, I knew that if I kept the pipeline open I would be signing my name under that performance forever. I do not enjoy punishment for the sake of seeing someone flail. I do not get a thrill from watching panic. I wanted to design a consequence that felt like a mirror. So I went line by line through the account and moved every scheduled distribution into a holding space he cannot see, and I suspended the card that made him feel adult in restaurants, and I halted the auto transfer that made rent look like a friendly suggestion. And I left untouched the portion earmarked for genuine emergencies. Because I am not a monster, and no one will ever know it sits there unless something awful happens, and if something awful happens I will answer the phone and I will move it back without a lecture, because love is not a hostage. I did not text him a speech or call to negotiate tone. I did not send a paragraph to my sister for approval. I did not ask my therapist for a permission slip. I took the trust from a light he could bask under to a lesson he would need to work for. And I wrote those 3 words on that plain card because I knew anything longer would invite debate, and debate is a sport he wins by exhausting people, while a short instruction turns the room into a quiet he cannot fill with charm. By the time I shut the laptop, the portal showed pending transfers and a balance that would read nothing once the bank did its daily sweep, and the envelope with his name sat where he could not miss it, and my own house felt heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier, because I understood exactly how long the morning would feel when his phone lit up. Lighter, because I had finally stopped financing the story that erased me, and as I turned off the kitchen light, I caught myself hoping he would surprise me, not with rage or threats, but with the kind of silence that comes when a man realizes there is only one thing left to do, which is grow up. And while I knew the odds were not in my favor, I also knew what the screen would show at sunrise. And when he opened his banking app after coffee or bragging or whatever ritual he uses to start a day, he would see what he has never seen before, which is the end of the faucet, the pause of the cushion, and a note that refuses to argue. Morning arrived with the kind of silence that pretends everything is fine until the first notification breaks it, and when the first vibration rolled across the counter, I knew it was him before I even looked. Because my son never calls this early unless something is on fire, and sure enough the message began with confusion that sounded almost polite, a question about whether there was some glitch. A quick mention that his card had been declined for a celebratory breakfast with friends, a half smile tucked into the words that expected me to fix whatever boring thing had gone wrong so he could get back to basking, and I let that message sit while I made coffee. Because I know the rhythm of denial, and I have no interest in interrupting a rhythm that needs to run its course. By the second message, the confusion had turned into irritation wrapped in entitlement, a suggestion that if I was trying to make a point, this was childish, an instruction to call the bank and straighten it out because he had plans. And I stepped into my home office and opened the drawer with the binder and laid it on the desk, not to taunt myself with the paper trail, but to center my day on facts, because old habits save you when people start performing, and the truth of our arrangement sat there in black ink: discretionary control, conditions, documentation of every deposit I had made since he was a teenager, and I told myself that if I answered anything today it would be to that reality, not to someone's tone. When the third message rolled in with a voice memo full of the harsh edge he uses when he feels cornered, telling me I was cruel and embarrassing and that his friends had seen him handed a check that bounced, I felt that old urge to rescue him pull at me. The one that used to send me running toward late fees and apologies and quick fixes that soothed the sting while teaching nothing, and I set the phone face down and wrote one sentence on a sticky note for myself, which said, "You will not speak until someone has read the documents," because I needed my own voice in the room more than I needed to win an argument before breakfast. The day stretched out with the patience of a clerk at a crowded window while the calls multiplied. My ex started in with the words he saves for moments when he wants to sound like a protector, accusing me of humiliating our son for my ego and threatening to involve a lawyer for what he called interference with his future, and I listened without offering him a battle to push against. Because there is nothing to debate about a signature I wrote years ago while he was chuckling at the idea that I would ever have the nerve to use it, and when he finished I told him calmly that the trust operated under my discretion for reasons he approved when he took the bigger vacation share, that I had exercised that discretion in response to hostility and irresponsibility, and that if he planned to engage counsel, he should be prepared to receive the full ledger of my contributions and his omissions. By early afternoon, the family group chat had detonated into a familiar script where cousins who never once asked how tuition worked were suddenly experts on unconditional love. My sister forwarded a message from his girlfriend describing my decision as psychological warfare. An aunt who believes every boy needs a steady hand demanded to know whether I understood the damage I had done to his confidence. And I answered none of them directly. I sent one email to the whole list with the subject line that said trust terms and timeline. I attached the signed pages and a simple set of dates and payments that told a plain story. I asked that any further comments arrive by email, and I muted the thread where people like to ring bells they never intend to answer. He called again around the time my work calendar usually gets lighter, his voice shaky now, accusing me of ruining his apartment situation since the automatic rent transfer had not arrived, saying his roommate was panicking and that the landlord had sent a warning, and I told him in an even tone that adults call landlords and arrange plans and then follow through, that there is money set aside for emergencies which does not include weekends out and new headphones, and that if he wanted help understanding a budget, I would meet him with a spreadsheet and a schedule, not with a drip line that let him keep pretending rent is a suggestion, and he hung up with a hiss that told me nothing had landed yet beyond the shock. By evening my phone had become a little machine built only to deliver blame, Friends of his messaged me with righteous lectures about supporting dreams. My ex's wife sent a long paragraph about my bitterness. A distant relative wrote a defense of boys who miss their mothers and act out, and I felt tired in the way you get tired when you are finally choosing the hard job of being the parent who says enough, not because it feels noble, but because you know the alternative is worse. And while I was washing a plate that did not need washing, the final call came from my ex, leveled and lawyerly now, saying an emergency hearing was coming, that I had overstepped, that a judge would force me to reinstate the funds and apologize for the damage. And I dried my hands and said he should put everything in writing and copy his attorney, because I would be responding with exhibits, and he laughed the brittle laugh he uses before he swings, and he told me to prepare for a fight. That was the moment I stopped waiting for anyone to listen and decided to take out every receipt, every statement, every forgotten transfer and parking ticket and late fee I had quietly absorbed, and build the clearest picture of who paid for what and who used that comfort to throw speeches in my face, which meant that when he threatened court I did not flinch. I pulled the boxes from the closet and decided to open the vault. The threat of court did not scare me so much as it focused me, because people who shout about judges often count on you to fold before the filing fee is even paid, and I have learned that the only antidote to performance is paperwork. So I cleared the dining table, opened the binder, pulled the bank boxes from the hall closet, and began building the timeline that has existed in my head for years, but never lived on paper in a way anyone else could see, which meant pulling statements that showed each tuition wire, each late fee I covered, each deposit marked living expenses that arrived on time while apologies arrived late, each text where he promised to call the landlord and did not, each receipt for headphones and weekends away that somehow qualified as essential because creativity apparently needs premium sound and premium cocktails. I drafted one calm letter to the trustee, nothing dramatic, just a straightforward notice that discretionary distributions had been paused pursuant to the clause we negotiated in the divorce, with references to the specific provisions and a short statement of the hostility that triggered the decision, and I attached a copy of the party clip where he smirked through the line, "You were never there for me, you do not belong here." Not because I wanted to embarrass him, but because the trustee is a person who needs documentation to put in a file when a beneficiary complains, and I would not ask that person to rely on my summary when a link would do the job cleanly. Then I wrote a second letter, this one to my ex and his lawyer, whose name he dropped like a talisman, laying out a chronology that did not sneer or editorialize. A month-by-month list for the last several years where funds left my accounts and landed in our son's comfort, with parenthetical notes about missed contributions from the other parent when applicable. And I finished with a paragraph citing the discretionary language that he himself once insisted would never matter, because I was too soft to use it, which is exactly why I fought to keep it, and I asked, politely, that any future accusations be accompanied by contradictory documentation. A request I knew would go unanswered, because documentation is the one thing his charm has never produced. While the printer worked, I called the provider that handled the auto insurance and removed my card from the policy that covered a car I co-signed, and he drove like a man who believed curbs moved out of the way for favorite sons. And I called the financing company and asked what would happen if payments were not made on a vehicle that had been delinquent twice already in the past year, which is when the representative reminded me of the clause that allows repossession after a missed payment beyond the grace period, and I thanked her in the kind of voice that lets you hear your own steadiness, because I could feel the old wobble trying to return, the one that whispers, "Fix it now and they will stop," and I was not fixing anything today except the record. By noon the emergency hearing existed only as a threat in a text bubble, but the real court had already convened around my inbox where adults with titles responded to documentation with deference. The trustee acknowledged my authority and asked whether I wanted them to direct any requests to counsel. My ex's lawyer sent a cautious reply asking for the complete trust language and the signed divorce decree, which I provided within minutes. And the cousins who love group chats were suddenly quiet. Because email requires a different kind of courage than a thread full of emojis and slogans about unconditional love, and I allowed myself one long exhale before the doorbell rang with a speed that told me the accusation campaign had turned into a house call. He stood on the porch with that heat in his eyes that used to make me cave, and behind him I could see his phone lighting up with messages from friends who were not there to help him carry anything heavy. And he started in immediately with a speech about betrayal and about how I had ruined his life for a comment at a party he swore I had misunderstood, and I let him finish without interruption. Because I have learned that interrupting a performance only lengthens it, then I stepped aside and pointed him toward the dining table where the binder and the boxes and the letters sat like a small courtroom, and I told him that if he wanted to talk we would talk in the presence of facts. He flipped pages with the restless energy of someone who expects the evidence to dissolve if he turns quickly enough. And when he found the section that listed every deposit I had made since the first semester and the notes about each time I covered a bill his father had promised and missed, he went quiet in a way that told me the story in his head had finally met the story in the ledger, and then he tried a different angle, asking whether I enjoyed humiliating him, whether I took pleasure in watching him scramble, and I told him I take no pleasure in panic and a great deal of relief in boundaries, that I had set aside genuine emergency funds that would go straight to a hospital or a necessary move if life punched him in the throat. But that rent paid by me while he mocked me in public did not qualify as life punching him, it qualified as me funding my own erasure, which was over as of last night. He said fine, he would drive to his father's and stay there while they sorted out this insanity, and he reached for the keys on his lanyard like a man stepping into a familiar escape hatch. And I walked with him to the front step and gestured to the driveway where he had left the car slanted across the line as always, and for a second he did not understand what he was looking at because understanding requires emptiness. And emptiness is a new language for him, and when the gap in the concrete finally registered, he spun toward me with a shock that was part outrage and part disbelief, and I told him calmly that the finance company had exercised its rights after repeated delinquencies, that the grace period had ended, that the payment he expected from the trust had not arrived because I had paused it, and that adults who treat vehicles like toys sometimes end up walking. He opened his mouth to launch another monologue, and the screen on his phone lit with a new notification sound I recognized from my own life, the one a bank uses when a payment fails in a way that triggers a string of consequences. And he stared at it, and then at me like the ground had changed texture, and I let the silence sit there between us, because silence can be a teacher when words have failed, and in that gap I could see the boy I raised and the man he might be fighting for the microphone inside his head, which is when he said we are not done, and I said no, we are not, and I stepped back into the house and left him standing on a driveway that had learned a new trick, which was to be empty. By the time the porch light had cooled and the driveway remembered it was just concrete, my inbox had filled with stiff sentences from people who prefer to outsource their spines to stationery. The trustee acknowledging my discretion with the kind of measured language that says this is routine, not scandal. My ex's lawyer softening from thunder to drizzle once the documents landed in his lap. A few relatives offering careful apologies that tried to straddle both sides without committing to either, and in that thinner air I understood that the noise had always been a mask for one simple request, which was that I continue paying for the privilege of being erased. So I poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and waited for the final conversation that would decide whether any of this could still turn into a life and not just a story. He came back after dark with that tired posture people wear when the day has taken its turn and refuses to turn back, and he opened with the speech he must have practiced in the car about love and mistakes and how I had gone too far for a sentence he regretted. And I let him set the words down between us without slicing them apart. Then I told him we were going to talk like the two adults we keep insisting he already is. No shouting, no performance, no phone on the table, just the ledger and the terms, and I slid a folder toward him the way you slide a menu to someone who swears he is not hungry and watch him realize he is starving. I told him plainly that I had not touched a cent for shoes or trips or petty revenge, that I had moved the trust out of the easy pipeline and into a holding space under my authority with a written instruction filed at the trustee's office, that the emergency reserve remained intact for real harm and not for embarrassment, and that the rest of the money now sat behind a door with a very simple lock, a lock he could open with proof, not promises, specifically with evidence of a steady job held. For 1 full year without disappearing, with pay stubs that match the calendar and a basic budget that balances on actual math, with no bounced payments and no new debts taken out to fake adulthood. And when that year is done and the proof is clean, I will release the funds in a structured way that cannot evaporate in a weekend, because I am done funding freefall. He stared at me like I had suggested sending him to the moon with a paper bag for oxygen. Then he asked what happens if he refuses to play my little game, and I told him there is no game, and there never was. There is a choice. And if he chooses not to meet the conditions, the instruction I filed turns the principal into scholarships at the community college whose registrar once watched me pay his late fees without a sigh. Small grants in his grandmother's maiden name for students who work nights and do not have an audience, and I said it without venom because this is not punishment. This is the only way I can live with the money I earned without continuing to buy my own disappearance. He called it cruel, and I said cruel is telling your mother she does not belong at the party she paid for. Cruel is using a card with my name behind it to toast independence. Cruel is leaning on a woman's labor like it is a utility with no meter. And I told him I am not interested in moral sermons about unconditional love from a crowd that has never once paid a late fee on time. I am interested in the kind of love that grows a spine, which looks boring and feels hard and sounds like a calendar alarm that says get up and go anyway. He tried to bargain, to shorten the horizon, to ask for exceptions that would keep the spirit of the old arrangement while letting us pretend the rules had changed, and I told him the terms were firm because they had to be. But that I would meet him halfway in exactly one place. I would sit with him while he called the landlord and drafted a written plan, and I would cover the single late fee that keeps the roof from wobbling while he starts for real, and after that he would live on what he earns, and the emergency reserve would stay sealed unless life throws a punch that would drop any person to their knees. And he looked at me like he hated me, and I told him he was allowed to. Hatred is lighter than dependency, and it burns off faster when you have to be at work by morning. We sat in a silence that did not feel empty. It felt like the moment before a decision grows legs, and then he nodded once in that jerky way he used to nod as a child when he did not want to admit he was done fighting. And he asked whether I would help him rewrite his resume and whether I knew anyone who would take a call about a starter position, and I said yes to both because boundaries are not the same thing as abandonment. And we made a list with the kind of basic steps he once called beneath him, and when he left he did not slam the door. He just walked down to the street and kept going because there was no car waiting to carry him away from the conversation. The next morning the texts were shorter, a screenshot of a schedule, a note that he had asked the landlord for a meeting, a complaint about the bus that did not ask me for a ride, and for the first time in years I felt something unclench, not triumph exactly. More like the unglamorous peace that comes when you pick the hard thing and keep picking it, and I printed the trustee's acknowledgement and slid it into the drawer with the other papers that keep my life from being rewritten by whoever talks the loudest, and I stood at the sink and let the water run and thought about how every story in this family has always chased applause, and how my favorite moment today was a tiny one with no audience at all. A boy who will have to grow into a man standing at a bus stop with his phone in his pocket because there is nothing left to demand, only a day to start. If in a year he brings me a stack of proof with no theater attached and a face that has learned the difference between smirking and smiling, I will release what I promised, and I will do it without a speech, and if he does not, I will fund strangers who are already the adults he keeps pretending to be, and either way I will not be erased, because the final move was never about starving a child, it was about taking my name back from a story that spent it carelessly, and that, at last, is done.